The setting sun cast long shadows across Oak Hill Avenue as Officer James Thompson drummed his fingers on his steering wheel, his 6th hour of a mind-numbing patrol stretching endlessly before him. The sweet aroma of coffee from his 3rd cup mingled with the artificial pine scent of his cruiser's air freshener, while he watched the perfectly manicured lawns and Victorian mansions through heavy-lidded eyes that had seen enough entitled residence for one day. The radio crackled with routine calls, none requiring his attention in this upscale neighborhood, where the biggest crimes typically involved noise complaints from garden parties or teenagers playing music too loud after sunset. Thompson adjusted his position in the seat, his bulletproof vest pressing uncomfortably against his chest in the humid evening air, as he observed the regular parade of dog walkers and joggers in their expensive athletic wear. 15 years on this beat had taught Thompson every nuance of Oak Hill Avenue, from the rhythmic sprinklers that activated at precisely 6:30 p.m. to the exact shade of white that was acceptable for picket fences in this historic district. He took pride in knowing every car that belonged, and more importantly, every car that didn't belong, in these 6 blocks of carefully curated affluence where home prices started at 7 figures. His eyes snapped to attention as an unfamiliar gleam caught his peripheral vision. The midnight black Mercedes S-Class rolled past his position with a quiet purr that spoke of German engineering and old money, but something about it triggered his carefully honed instincts. The windows were tinted just within legal limits, the chrome accents catching the dying sunlight as it moved with almost deliberate precision through the stop sign. Thompson straightened in his seat, his hand unconsciously moving to rest near his gear shift as he observed the driver through the windshield, his jaw tightening at the sight of a black man behind the wheel dressed in what appeared to be an expensive suit, the type of clothing that Thompson associated with the corporate lawyers and doctors who populated Oak Hill. Except in his 15 years had never seen a resident who looked like this driver. Reaching for his onboard computer, Thompson began running scenarios through his head, calculating response times and potential backup requirements, while simultaneously scanning his memory for any recent reports of burglaries or suspicious activities in the neighboring communities. The Mercedes moved with careful precision down the street, each turn signal properly activated, each stop complete and textbook perfect, which only served to heighten Thompson's suspicion. Years of experience had taught Thompson that criminals often tried too hard to follow traffic laws when attempting to avoid attention. The driver's perfect behavior, combined with his presence in this exclusive neighborhood, set off every warning bell in Thompson's trained mind. He watched as the luxury vehicle navigated the curved street, its polished surface reflecting the warm colors of sunset, while residents walking their designer dogs turned to stare with the same suspicion Thompson felt growing in his gut. Officer Thompson had made his reputation in the department by trusting his instincts about who belonged and who didn't in the neighborhoods under his watch, had earned commendations for preventing several burglaries in similar communities by identifying suspicious vehicles before they could become active crime scenes. His colleagues often joked that he could smell trouble before it happened, and right now every nerve ending in his body was screaming that this situation warranted investigation. He keyed in the vehicle's plate number, watching as the Mercedes continued its journey through the neighborhood, noting how the driver seemed to be looking at specific houses in a way that Thompson had seen too many times before in his career. Casing expensive properties was an art form, and this guy, despite his expensive suit and car, was exhibiting textbook behavior that Thompson had documented in dozens of arrest reports. Without conscious thought, Thompson found himself easing his cruiser out from its observation point, his training kicking in. As he began to parallel the Mercedes' course from a discreet distance, the weight of his badge and the responsibility it carried settling around him like a familiar comfort blanket, as he prepared to demonstrate once again why he was considered one of the most effective patrol officers in the district. Thompson's adrenaline spiked as he tailed the Mercedes, his mind already writing the story about a suspicious vehicle when the driver executed a perfect stop and signal at every turn, making Thompson even more determined to find a reason. His cherried lights shattered the evening calm as nearby dog walkers stopped to stare, the driver pulling over with practiced precision that somehow irritated Thompson even more. The red and blue lights painted wild patterns across the perfectly trimmed hedges of Oak Hill Avenue as Thompson radioed in his position and plate number, his voice carrying the confident tone of a veteran officer who had conducted thousands of traffic stops throughout his career. The dispatcher's voice crackled back with confirmation, but Thompson was already focused on his approach strategy, studying the Mercedes through his windshield as if he could see through the dark-tinted glass. Shifting his cruiser into park, Thompson performed his routine safety check, adjusting his body camera with practiced movements while observing the Mercedes for any suspicious movement. His right hand instinctively brushed his holster, ensuring his weapon was secure. As he had done countless times before on similar stops, the evening air felt thick with tension as curious neighbors began to emerge from their homes, drawn to the spectacle of flashing lights in their ordinarily peaceful enclave. Thompson took note of the Mercedes' exact position, how it had pulled over precisely 1 foot from the curb, the driver's careful adherence to proper traffic stop protocol, only serving to heighten his suspicion. In his experience, people who had something to hide often knew procedure too well, almost as if they had studied it. The thought made his jaw clench as he stepped out of his cruiser, his boots crunching on the manicured grass strip between sidewalk and street. The setting sun cast long shadows across the scene, creating dramatic silhouettes as Thompson approached the vehicle, using his tactical flashlight. Despite the remaining daylight, its beam cutting through the Mercedes' tinted windows in a show of authority. He noted the vehicle's pristine condition, no scratches, no dents, not even a hint of dust on its surface. Something about its perfection seemed almost theatrical to Thompson, as if it were trying too hard to belong in this wealthy neighborhood. Proceeding with exaggerated caution, Thompson positioned himself slightly behind the driver's door, his practiced stance designed to maintain tactical advantage. While his free hand rested near his weapon, the neighbors had multiplied now, gathering in small clusters on their front lawns, their evening walks forgotten as they whispered among themselves, some holding up phones to record the scene, their presence adding an unexpected layer of pressure to the situation. Thompson rapped on the window with more force than necessary, his knuckles striking the glass with sharp authority, designed to establish dominance. From the first moment of contact, he could make out the driver's silhouette through the tinted glass, noting how the man seemed to move, with deliberate slowness, reaching for what Thompson assumed would be his registration and insurance. The casual confidence in those movements stirred something uncomfortable in Thompson's gut. The window hummed as it lowered, revealing the interior of the luxury vehicle, its leather seats and wood trim. Speaking of wealth, that seemed incongruous with Thompson's preconceptions. The scent of expensive cologne wafted out, mixing with the evening air, while the driver sat motionless, his hands visible on the steering wheel in a position that spoke of familiarity with traffic stop procedures. Thompson noted the man's tailored suit, the gold watch on his wrist, and the university law school ring on his finger, all details that should have given him pause, but instead fueled his growing suspicion. Testing his authority, Thompson barked out his demands for license and registration, his tone carrying the edge that had served him well in countless similar situations, a kind of tone that invited no argument and typically revealed nervous behavior in those with something to hide. Yet the driver remained composed, his movements measured and unhurried as he reached for his documents, maintaining an air of dignity that Thompson found increasingly irritating with each passing second. Marcus Johnson felt his heart rate quicken, not from fear, but from a familiar fury as he watched the officer approach in his rearview mirror, his hands gripping the leather steering wheel of his beloved Mercedes. While 20 years of legal experience screamed at him to document everything, Johnson activated his phone's camera just as Thompson rapped on his window with enough force to make the glass shudder. The weight of 2 decades prosecuting civil rights violations settled heavily on Johnson's shoulders as he observed Officer Thompson's aggressive stance in his side mirror, the scene unfolding exactly as it had in hundreds of cases that had crossed his desk, each movement, each word, each microaggression painfully familiar. Yet this time he wasn't reviewing body camera footage in his office but living it firsthand in the very neighborhood he called home. Johnson maintained his composure, his Harvard law training kicking in as he mentally cataloged every detail of the encounter, the exact time, the specific location, the officer's badge number, and name tag, all while keeping his hands visible on the steering wheel where they could be clearly seen by both Thompson's body camera and his own phones recording the leather soft beneath his palms, grounding him in the moment as he prepared for what he knew would come next. The evening air rushed into the Mercedes cabin as Johnson lowered his window, the scent of his wife's carefully tended roses mixing with the tension that radiated from Officer Thompson, who stood with his hand resting too casually on his weapon. Johnson noted how the officer's fingers twitched near the holster, a detail that would become significant in the report. He was already composing in his mind, while outwardly maintaining the calm demeanor that had served him well in countless courtroom battles. Carefully controlling his voice, Johnson spoke with measured precision, explaining that he lived just 3 houses down, his words carrying the weight of authority earned through years of legal practice. Yet Thompson cut him off mid-sentence, the officer's interruption sharp and dismissive, his demand for identification carrying an undertone of presumed guilt that Johnson had heard too many times before in testimony from officers who had found themselves facing judicial review. The growing crowd of neighbors added another layer of complexity to the situation. Johnson recognized faces he had seen at community meetings, people who had smiled and waved at him just that morning as he left for work, yet now they stood in uncertain silence, their presence both witnessing and enabling the scene that played out before them, their phones raised to record, yet none stepping forward to speak the truth they all knew. Thompson demanded Johnson step out of the vehicle, his tone brooking no argument as he claimed a match to a suspect description that Johnson knew was likely non-existent, his 2 decades of prosecution experience having taught him how often that particular phrase was used to justify questionable stops. The fabric of his Italian suit caught slightly on the leather seat as he complied, his movements deliberately slow and precise, every gesture calculated to avoid any possibility of misinterpretation. Standing beside his Mercedes, Johnson towered over Thompson, his 6'2" frame carrying the physical presence that had served him well in the courtroom, yet in this moment that same stature seemed to make the officer more aggressive, more determined to establish dominance. Johnson could feel the cool evening air through his suit jacket as Thompson began his practice pat-down routine, the indignity of the moment burning in his chest, even as his legal mind categorized each procedural violation. The sound of more approaching sirens filled the air, backup responding to a situation that existed only in Thompson's imagination. Johnson remained silent as additional patrol cars arrived, their lights painting Oak Hill Avenue in surreal patterns of red and blue, while he focused on controlling his breathing, remembering every similar scene he had prosecuted, knowing that his response now would become evidence later, his phone still recording in his pocket, capturing audio that would soon make its way into a very different kind of report than Officer Thompson expected. Neighbors emerged from their colonial homes like moths drawn to drama as Thompson made a show of loudly declaring Johnson matched a suspect's description. Johnson stood handcuffed in his tailored Tom Ford suit while Mrs. Patterson from next door peered through her fingers, the same woman who had brought him a welcome basket when he moved in, yet now stood silent as Thompson roughly searched his car. The growing crowd swelled to nearly 24 residents, their evening routines abandoned in favor of the unfolding spectacle. Children pressed against upstairs windows, while parents stood in carefully manicured front lawns, their faces illuminated by the harsh rotating lights of 3 patrol cars that had now arrived at the scene. The mechanical clicks of phone cameras provided a steady backbeat to Officer Thompson's theatrical performance. Mrs. Patterson clutched her designer handbag, the welcome basket from 5 years ago, seemingly forgotten, as she whispered to her husband about property values and neighborhood safety. The same woman who had borrowed Johnson's hedge trimmer last weekend, who had attended his summer barbecues, who had praised his wife's contribution to the community garden, now avoided his direct gaze as Thompson pushed him against the Mercedes, treating him like a common criminal. The cold metal of the handcuffs bit into Johnson's wrists as Thompson conducted his search with excessive thoroughness, pulling out Johnson's briefcase and spreading legal documents across the hood of the car, the Lewis case files he had been reviewing scattered in the evening breeze, some landing in the pristine lawn. He paid $200 a week to maintain. Johnson watched as his neighbors stepped back from the papers as if they were contaminated, their faces a mix of fascination and discomfort. Mr. Richards from across the street, the same man who had sought Johnson's legal advice about his son's minor traffic violation just last month, stood filming with his iPhone, maintaining what he probably thought was a discreet distance. His wife Susan, who had organized the neighborhood watch with Johnson last spring, tugged nervously at his sleeve, suggesting perhaps they should go inside, but unable to tear herself away from the scene. Thompson, growing increasingly frustrated with finding nothing suspicious in the vehicle, began questioning Johnson about his presence in the neighborhood, his voice carrying across the perfectly landscaped yards loud enough for everyone to hear the implied accusation in his tone, the same yards where Johnson had helped plant trees during last year's community beautification project, where he had judged the Halloween decoration contest, where he had built his life over the past 5 years. Young Tyler Matthews, whose bicycle Johnson had fixed last summer, watched wide-eyed from his driveway as his parents hustled him inside, their whispered explanations carrying across the evening air about bad people and safety and police knowing best. Johnson could see the confusion on the boy's face through the window, the same expression he had seen too many times in his work dealing with civil rights violations, the moment when innocence confronts prejudice. Rebecca Shen, the local real estate agent who had sold Johnson his home, stood frozen halfway up her walkway, her face a mask of professional neutrality, even as her eyes darted between Johnson and her other clients in the crowd. The same woman who had bragged about having a state prosecutor living in her portfolio now seemed to be mentally calculating the impact this scene would have on her carefully curated neighborhood image. The temperature dropped with the setting sun, but no one offered Johnson his suit jacket, which lay spread open on the Mercedes hood next to his Harvard Law diploma that Thompson had pulled from his briefcase, the framed certificate he had been bringing home to replace the one damaged in last week's storm now served as evidence in an investigation built on nothing but assumptions and bias. The gold embossed letters, catching the last rays of sunlight as if mockingly highlighting the irony of the situation. The holding cell stank of despair and cheek cleaner as Johnson sat straight-backed on the metal bench, watching Thompson swagger around the precinct, showing off his big catch to fellow officers. Johnson pulled out his secret weapon, his phone call going not to a lawyer or family member, but to his assistant with very specific instructions for tomorrow's court appearance. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting harsh shadows across the gray concrete walls, while Johnson observed the station dynamics through years of prosecutorial experience, his eyes tracking each officer who passed by his cell, noting their badge numbers, their interactions, their subtle reactions to his presence in their domain. Some avoided eye contact, while others stared too long, their curiosity poorly disguised behind professional masks. Thompson held court at the booking desk, his voice carrying down the corridor as he regaled his colleagues with the tale of the suspicious Mercedes and its driver, his narrative growing more elaborate with each telling. Johnson listened with the practiced ear of a seasoned prosecutor, mentally noting each embellishment, each procedural violation, each assumption that would soon unravel in the harsh light of the courtroom tomorrow. The metal bench beneath Johnson remained cold. Despite his hours of sitting, the discomfort a minor inconvenience compared to the strategic advantage he was building by remaining in custody, his Tom Ford suit now wrinkled but his dignity intact as he mentally composed the training program that would emerge from this incident, knowing that every moment of his discomfort would serve a greater purpose in reforming the department. Other detainees shuffled through the booking area, their curious glances at Johnson in his expensive suit adding to the surreal nature of the scene. A young officer who Johnson recognized from recent court appearances did a double take as he passed the cell, his face showing a flash of recognition before quickly hurrying away. Johnson allowed himself a small smile, knowing the whispers would soon begin spreading through the station. The night shift began arriving, their fresh uniforms and alert faces contrasting with the weary expressions of those ending their tours. Thompson lingered well past his shift change, embellishing his story for new audiences, while Johnson maintained his composed silence, each passing hour adding weight to the impact that tomorrow would bring, his mind already choreographing the courtroom scene that would unfold. Johnson watched as his personal belongings were cataloged, his Harvard Law class ring placed in a plastic bag, his Bar Association card drawing confused looks from the booking officer, his state prosecutor's badge buried at the bottom of the pile, its significance yet to be discovered. Thompson remained oblivious to the credibility of his suspect, focused instead on the admiring looks from junior officers who gathered around him like eager students. The night wore on as Johnson deliberately declined to post bail, knowing his continued presence in the cell would only strengthen the impact of tomorrow's revelation. His phone call to his assistant Sarah had set specific events in motion, her barely contained fury at his situation channeled into precise preparation for the morning session, the wheels of justice turning slowly but with inevitable purpose. Voices echoed through the station as shift change approached midnight, the fluorescent lights never dimming as Johnson maintained his vigilant observation of station operations, his legal mind documenting patterns, procedures, and protocols that would soon find their way into new training materials, his own discomfort transforming into fuel for systematic change, while Thompson remained at his desk, carefully crafting his arrest report, unaware of the gathering storm. The courthouse buzzed with its usual morning energy as Thompson strode through the metal detectors, practicing his concerned officer face in the hallway mirror. He barely registered the clusters of suited lawyers gathering in unusual numbers, or the news crews setting up their equipment outside the magnificent granite building, their presence a harbinger of the storm about to break. Thompson adjusted his dress uniform in the reflections, smoothing imaginary wrinkles from his pressed shirt, while mentally rehearsing his testimony about the suspicious vehicle in the upscale neighborhood, the same story he had polished to a shine over numerous tellings at the precinct last night, his confidence radiating through his practiced stance as he nodded to familiar faces in the morning crowd. Seasoned courthouse regulars noticed something different in the air that morning. The bailiffs exchanged knowing looks as more senior prosecutors than usual filtered into the building, the district attorney's office seemingly emptying itself into the main courtroom where Thompson's case would be heard first on the docket, the growing audience drawing curious glances from other officers arriving for their own cases. The marble halls echoed with whispered conversations as legal aides rushed past clutching coffee cups and tablets, their usual morning routines tinged with an underlying excitement that Thompson failed to notice. Too absorbed in his own preparations, his mind focused on presenting the perfect image of vigilant law enforcement protecting an affluent neighborhood from potential threats. Sarah Johnson's assistant moved efficiently through the courthouse, her phone pressed to her ear. As she coordinated the morning's carefully orchestrated events, her eyes tracking Thompson as he preened before the mirror, a thin smile playing across her lips, as she confirmed the attendance of key department heads and civil rights attorneys, each piece falling perfectly into place according to her boss' instructions. The gallery of the courtroom filled quickly with an unusual mix of spectators. Senior prosecutors sat shoulder to shoulder with civil rights attorneys, while police brass filtered in trying to appear casual despite their mounting confusion at the gathering crowd. Thompson remained oblivious to the significance of the audience as he arranged his paperwork at the prosecutor's table, assuming the gathered officials were there for other cases. Local reporters jostled for position in the press section, their presence unusual for a routine arraignment. The courthouse regulars recognized the signs of an impending newsworthy event, though none could quite piece together what was about to unfold. The air grew thick with anticipation as more chairs were brought in to accommodate the overflowing crowd. Officer Thompson finally began to sense something amiss as he noticed his direct supervisor enter the courtroom, followed by the police chief himself, their faces carefully neutral as they took seats in the front row behind him, the weight of their presence adding a note of uncertainty to his previously confident demeanor. Still, he reassured himself that his arrest was solid, his report meticulously detailed. The defense table remained conspicuously empty as the clerk began organizing the morning docket. Thompson checked his watch, growing increasingly aware of the unusual atmosphere in the courtroom, the whispered conversations, the expectant faces, the subtle shifting of the gathering crowd, all building toward something he couldn't quite grasp. The polished wooden barriers and formal decor suddenly feeling more imposing than comforting. Judge Gloria Martinez raised her eyebrows at the unusually packed courtroom as she entered, the shuffle of rising bodies masking Thompson's sharp intake of breath when the clerk announced Marcus Johnson, Chief State Prosecutor and head of the Civil Rights Division, the same man Thompson had forced to spread eagle against hot metal just 12 hours earlier. The recognition hit Thompson like a physical blow, his face draining of color, as Johnson emerged from the judge's chambers rather than through the public entrance, his crisp new suit and commanding presence drawing every eye in the courtroom as he moved with practiced ease toward the defense table, the same confident stride Thompson had found so suspicious the night before, now carrying the weight of 2 decades of courtroom authority. Whispers rippled through the gallery as Johnson placed his briefcase on the table, the same briefcase Thompson had roughly searched, spreading its contents across the hood of the Mercedes. Senior prosecutors nodded in greeting to their colleague, while police brass shifted uncomfortably in their seats, the gravity of the situation finally descending upon the room like a heavy cloak. Thompson felt sweat beginning to bead along his hairline as he realized the magnitude of his error. Judge Martinez settled into her chair, her experienced eyes taking in the scene before her, the packed gallery, the unusually large media presence, the palpable tension hanging in the air. As Johnson methodically arranged his materials on the defense table, his movements unhurried and deliberate, each gesture carrying the confidence of a man who had stood before this bench hundreds of times before, but never quite like this. Thompson watched as his supervisor leaned forward to whisper urgently with the police chief, their concerned expressions reflecting the fluorescent lighting from above, while Johnson stood to address the court, his voice carrying the same calm authority it had held the night before when attempting to explain that he lived in the neighborhood. The irony of the situation not lost on the assembled crowd as they watched the state's most prominent prosecutor prepare to handle his own defense. The gallery held its collective breath as Johnson turned, slightly fixing Thompson with the same measured gaze that had unnerved countless opposing attorneys over the years. The same eyes that had looked at him through the Mercedes window now regarded him from across the courtroom, their roles dramatically reversed as Thompson struggled to maintain his composure under the weight of that steady stare. Bailiffs stationed around the courtroom maintained their professional demeanor, though their eyes betrayed their interest in the unfolding drama as Johnson began to speak, his words carrying the weight of both personal experience and professional authority. The same voice that had remained calm during his arrest now commanded the attention of every person in the room, laying out not just the events of the previous night, but their broader implications for the department. Thompson felt the eyes of his fellow officers on him, some sympathetic, others accusatory, as Johnson methodically detailed each moment of the traffic stop, his narrative supported by both his phone's recording and Thompson's own body camera footage playing silently on the courtroom screens, the crystal clear images showing every assumption, every overreach, every moment Thompson had mistaken authority for suspicion. Reporters scribbled furiously in their notebooks as Johnson continued his presence behind the defense table, somehow more commanding than any prosecutor Thompson had faced before. The irony of defending himself against charges he typically prosecuted, adding another layer to the already thick tension in the room, while Judge Martinez listened intently, her expression giving no hint of her thoughts as the scene unfolded before her. The courtroom fell into stunned silence as security footage played on the oversized screens showing Johnson arriving home in his Mercedes day after day. While Johnson detailed each of the 63 similar profiling cases he prosecuted, his voice carrying the weight of both personal and professional authority. Thompson slumped lower in his chair as his supervisor scribbled furious notes beside him. The security footage continued rolling, displaying crystal clear images from Johnson's home surveillance system spanning the past 5 years, each clip methodically documenting his routine arrivals and departures in the same Mercedes that Thompson had deemed suspicious, the timestamp on each video fragment serving as a silent testimony to Johnson's established presence in the neighborhood he had been accused of infiltrating. Johnson moved through his presentation with practiced precision, his prosecutorial experience evident in every carefully chosen word, as he connected his personal experience to the broader pattern of bias that had plagued the department. Evidence boxes stacked neatly beside him containing case files from dozens of similar incidents, each one representing a citizen who had faced the same baseless suspicion that had led to his own arrest. The gathered prosecutors watched their colleague with a mix of pride and discomfort as he seamlessly wove together witness statements from neighbors who had known him for years, property tax records proving his residence, and documentation of his community involvement, including photographs from the very neighborhood watch meetings where he had worked alongside local law enforcement to improve community safety. Thompson felt the weight of each piece of evidence like physical blows as Johnson systematically dismantled every assumption, every justification, every hollow explanation that had seemed so solid the night before. The officer's career flashing before his eyes as his supervisor continued taking notes in sharp, angry strokes, while the police chief stared straight ahead, his expression carved from stone. The courtroom screens shifted to display Johnson's professional credentials, his Harvard Law degree, his Bar Association membership, his numerous commendations for civil rights prosecution, each achievement highlighting the profound irony of his detention. While Johnson continued his methodical presentation, his voice never rising yet carrying an authority that seemed to fill every corner of the suddenly too small courtroom. Reporters' pens scratched frantically across notepads as Johnson revealed statistics from his office's ongoing investigation into departmental bias, his personal experience now transformed into a powerful catalyst for the very changes he had been working to implement. The data displayed on screen painting a damning picture of systemic issues that could no longer be ignored or explained away. Johnson produced records of similar incidents in the neighborhood, each case file adding another layer to the pattern of bias that had culminated in his own arrest, his analytical approach transforming personal humiliation into compelling evidence. While Thompson watched his own body camera footage play on screen, his recorded voice sounding increasingly hollow as Johnson annotated each procedural violation, each baseless assumption, each missed opportunity to de-escalate. The gallery sat transfixed as Johnson presented a detailed timeline of his 5 years in the neighborhood, interwoven with documented instances of similar profiling cases. He had prosecuted, the parallel narratives building to the inevitable intersection of his personal and professional lives in the events of the previous night, his presentation transforming the courtroom into a classroom where every observer became a student of systemic bias. Witnesses from the neighborhood shifted uncomfortably in their seats as Johnson played their own security footage showing his routine presence in the community, their previous silence during his arrest now cast in stark relief against the overwhelming evidence of his established residence, while Thompson watched his carefully constructed narrative crumble beneath the weight of irrefutable proof that had been literally at his fingertips during the initial stop. Electricity crackled through the courtroom as Johnson rose for his final statement, his 6'2" frame commanding attention as he shared his vision for transforming this humiliation into systematic change, starting with the officer before him. Thompson finally looked up, meeting Johnson's gaze for the first time as the chief prosecutor outlined a mandatory retraining program that would bear Thompson's name, ensuring his mistake would educate thousands. Johnson moved away from the defense table, his measured steps carrying him to the center of the courtroom where he had stood countless times before prosecuting similar cases, but now his words carried the weight of personal experience as he addressed not just the judge but the entire assembly, his voice steady and clear as he outlined his comprehensive plan for departmental reform, starting with the creation of the Thompson Initiative for Police Training and Community Relations. The gathered police brass sat in stunned silence as Johnson detailed how his own arrest would become a foundational case study in the department's new training curriculum, his personal humiliation transformed into a powerful teaching tool, while Thompson watched his name become synonymous with the very reforms he had resisted, his legacy forever altered from decorated officer to cautionary tale in the span of a single morning. Security footage from the previous night played silently behind Johnson as he spoke, the images of his arrest now reframed as educational material, his professional analysis breaking down each moment of bias, each missed opportunity for de-escalation, his voice carrying no hint of vengeance as he transformed personal indignity into institutional improvement, while reporters frantically documented every word. Judge Martinez leaned forward, her years of experience evident in her thoughtful expression as Johnson presented the framework for a new community oversight committee that would work alongside the police department to review similar incidents, his own experience providing the blueprint for a bridge between law enforcement and the community they served, his vision extending far beyond personal vindication to genuine systemic change. Thompson felt the weight of history settling onto his shoulders as Johnson described how future officers would study this incident, examining each decision, each assumption, each action that had led to this moment, the chief prosecutor's words painting a future where his mistake would prevent countless others, his shame transformed into a legacy of reform that would ripple through departments across the state. The gallery watched in amazement as Johnson outlined plans for community engagement programs, enhanced bias recognition training, and transparent accountability measures, his legal expertise merging with personal insight to create a comprehensive approach to reform, while his assistant distributed detailed proposals to department heads and civil rights attorneys, his preparation evident in every aspect of the presentation. Johnson turned his attention directly to Thompson, his gaze holding no anger as he explained how the officer's actions would become a catalyst for change, his mistake serving as the foundation for improved training and understanding, while Thompson struggled to maintain eye contact, the weight of responsibility settling onto him as he realized his role in this larger narrative was just beginning. The morning sun streamed through the high courthouse windows as Johnson concluded his presentation, his words resonating through the packed courtroom as he described his vision for a future where such incidents would become increasingly rare, his personal triumph transcending individual victory to become a moment of institutional transformation, while Judge Martinez nodded her approval of the proposed reforms. In his closing remarks, Johnson extended an unexpected olive branch to Thompson, inviting him to participate in the development of the training program that would bear his name, offering him the opportunity to transform his mistake into meaningful change, while the gathered observers watched the chief prosecutor demonstrate the very principles of redemption and growth that his program would champion.